So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today about making the most of mealtimes. And this is a great interest of mine, and it came out of some work that I had been doing with people living in the community who had dementia and recognizing the importance of mealtimes to keeping relationships and identity going for folks. And that led into thinking about, well, how does this change perhaps in a long-term care or retirement home environment, and how mealtimes can be important for quality of life for folks living in these situations. So why are mealtimes of interest at all to us as dietitians, as individuals who consume meals in long-term care retirement homes? In terms of nutrition folks and medical folks, it's really about thinking about malnutrition, which we know to be quite common in this group. We know that about 30 to 80% of Canadians in long-term care might have some level of malnutrition, which means their body isn't going to be functioning the way they'd like it to. Function in terms of walking, immunity, recovery from infections might be a challenge for these folks. We know that malnutrition as well is linked to hospitalizations, for example, and falls, and also mortality. The primary cause of malnutrition in this environment, retirement homes and long-term care, is poor food intake. So it's not because of excess need for nutrients, but that there's insufficient going in, basically. And we know from Canadian research that long-term care residents only consume about 50% of the food they're provided. And the amount of food they provide is meant to meet their nutritional needs. So if they're not consuming a full amount, they're going to have challenges that come to micronutrients as well as energy and protein. So why does poor food intake occur in this environment? Well, there's three things that I've identified through the literature in terms of food product, the eating environment itself, as well as the inability to consume food or access food. I'm going to focus in on mostly the eating environment today because that is what I think really could impact quality of life for folks as well. Certainly, though, the food product is extremely important, and my colleagues today will be talking about that food product in terms of specific nutrients as well as the quality of the food when thinking about modified texture foods. The ability to access and consume food is also a significant problem. This is predominantly an issue, though, in long-term care environments where people have dysphagia or need eating assistance. I have a really bad cold as well, so excuse me. So we've talked a little bit about malnutrition, but I'm going to challenge you to think about, it's not so much about nutritional status we should be thinking about when it comes to mealtimes, it's also quality of life. And I like to simply define quality of life as the freedom to do what you want to do. I asked my students in my course I was taking, Aging Nutrition, I said, then what is quality of life to you? They said, freedom. And if we think about that for people living in long-term care and retirement homes, being able to do what you want to do is going to be very important to your quality of life. And I think it is at least equally important, if not more important, than the nutrition outcomes that we're often targeting as dietitians and nutrition managers and family, thinking about folks living in retirement and long-term care. We are often, though, too concerned about the harm and risk that can happen when we provide food, and rather than what the older adult themselves want. Could you get me some water? Mealtimes are probably the most complex event in long-term care and retirement homes. If you think about all the things that have to happen to have a meal served to 125 people in this dining room within a 1 hour period of time, that's extremely complex. Bathing is certainly challenging for some folks, getting to and from places. Activities also have their interesting challenges perhaps, but mealtimes are the most complex activity that we do in this environment. And there's many things that impact that complexity. And I did this research quite a while ago now, but basically I had a student sit in a long-term care units and watch what happened in terms of meal observations. And she identified some key things were happening. In the center you see what we call resident activities. These resident activities are things like arriving. People have to get to the dining room. That can take a considerable amount of time if they have challenges with their function, for example, or need a wheelchair or a scooter to get there. Then they have to eat in the dining room. And if they have challenges with eating, that's going to be certainly a challenge when it comes to consuming enough food. They often have to wait, either wait to get to their table because someone needs to take them, they have to wait to receive their food, they might have to wait to get their walker brought to them so they can leave the dining room. That's an activity during this meal time. As well, we have socializing, so talking to staff as well as to other residents. We have distracting activities, like perhaps something happens, someone goes through with the vacuum cleaner, that would be a distracting activity in a retirement home perhaps. In long-term care, it might be someone drops something or someone throws something in the dining room. And then we have bleeding. All of those things have to happen in the 1 hour, 2 hour span that dining happens for folks in long-term care and retirement homes. On the outside are the things that impact that. I'll just give you a few examples. You can think of things like lack of control and lack of choice. You don't know when you're eating, where you're eating, with whom you're eating, and what you're eating. You have no control. That's a truly institutional environment. And we don't want that, right? That doesn't help quality of life. It doesn't give a sense of control. We also know that individual preferences are often lost with the need to provide for many. When you have to provide a meal for 300-400 residents, not everyone is going to be pleased with the food that's provided. It's obvious that that's impossible. Even in a home setting with 5 individuals, some like the food better than others, right? And so there's these challenges that your individual preferences are not going to be met. And then finally, regulations, policies, and routines often override what a resident wants. So for example, if people are supposed to be in the dining room at 8:30 for breakfast and they're used to sleeping in, their personal preference of sleeping in an institutional environment might be overridden to get them to the dining room in time. That's not what we want. And I'm going to show you a couple of quotes from a study I did with one of my graduate students. She actually asked, we had data from individuals who had dementia moving into either retirement or long-term care environments. And this were 2 things that they said. One was that often it feels like the meal is systematized. And then secondly, they have to adjust to dining with others. And so I'll quickly read out these quotes for you. So systemizing the meals. It's astounding in this place. If there are 90 people in here, I bet 70 of them enter the dining room at 1 minute after 5. Now, I can't eat dinner that early. I never could. We used to eat at 6:30 at night and so on. Always have done. But now we go down at about 5:45. But it's astounding how dinner has become the clock in this place. Breakfast, everybody's down at 8. Everybody's down at 12 for lunch. And everybody's down at 5 for dinner. I can't be that way. I've got to go down at 8:30 for breakfast. So you can see this individual is trying to be an individual within this larger system of dining in an environment that is perhaps a little bit more institutional. Then on the other side, we here have the issue of adjusting to dining with others. Well, we had this one person at the table who was inclined to be touchy. I haven't seen her do it, but I've heard that she's liable to snatch from other people's plates, that sort of thing. Some of their table manners are kind of careless. They don't realize it, they're handling food in a strange way and that sort of thing. This is a retirement environment, not a long-term care environment. So these things are happening, and it's challenging for folks coming from the community to adjust to living with others. So you might have heard some of these terms before, the idea of flexible dining, home-like dining, or fine dining. What does home-like dining mean to you? Anybody? When I say home-like dining, I see some people thinking. Any offerings? Sorry? Eating food like you did at home. Okay, so it's all about the individual preference, perhaps, for getting food. Okay? What about fine dining, when I use that term? What does that sound like to you? Yeah. Going out for dinner. So it's a special experience, going to have a really special meal, fine dining, waiter in a black suit. That's fine dining. Okay. And then flexible dining. That's another term that's often used in long-term care and retirement homes. What does that mean to you when I say flexible dining? Eat whatever time you wish. So it's really flexible. The point I did with that little exercise is everybody has a slightly different concept of what that means. And often when I talk to providers, they think about the physical side of the dining environment, like tablecloths, like time, like the food that's available. I'm going to contend it's a little bit more than that. What we really want to have quality of life is something a little bit more. I think flexibility means something called person-centered care. It means an individual is an individual, not a part of a larger system. And so that means we try to do some of the things that are going to meet the needs of that individual. Person-centered care has been around for quite a while in the long-term care and retirement home environment, although relatively few people have done research in this area when it comes to dining. Brooker defined it as valuing every single resident, using an individualized approach. Now, not everybody's going to need a fully individualized approach. Some people might be quite happy with getting 3 meals a day and it's hot and it's well cooked. Others might need that little extra individualization. Seeing things from the resident's perspective. So think about the anecdote I said of someone wanting to stay in bed a little bit longer and not get out of bed to go down for breakfast at 8:30. You see it from their perspective. They're stiff in the morning, they're not feeling so well. Maybe having a cup of coffee at their bedside might be more pleasurable to them than going down the dining room at 8:30. And then finally, providing a social environment that supports the psychological needs of individuals. And so a lot of this work actually came out of dealing with folks who have dementia, but I think it goes across all residents, whether or not they have dementia or other challenges. When I looked in the literature with a graduate student of mine, we tried to find out what was person-centered care, or PCC, when it came to mealtimes. And there were very similar things that Brooker had identified. First off, providing choices and preferences. The idea that people are given choice around their food, and it's also meeting their preferences. One of the things I often hear from folks is they don't like fancy names for food. They don't know what it is. And so that's not meeting their cultural preference of ordinary meat and potatoes or other things that they're used to eating. It's great to have an assistant like Hillary. Supporting independence is another piece. And so people talked about how can we support people to be as independent as possible without taking away their capacity to do at least some assisting of their own on eating or eating their own food. Promoting the social side of eating, and then finally showing respect. So how do you do that when you serve a meal? The Pioneer Network, if you haven't heard of this group, they're in the States, and they've been around for quite some time, and they're now focusing in on mealtimes specifically, but this idea of trying to make mealtimes more person-centered, and trying to make sure that when people live in a retirement home or long-term care, it's not institutional. So it's trying to achieve quality of life for folks. They came out with the new dining practice standards in 2011, and they identified, I've just put out some of the key concepts here. Some were the idea of a preferred context and environment for meals. This means people get to eat where they want, with whom they want, and when they want. It also talked about sufficient physical support, so they feel supported, but not that they no longer have capacity. So that's a very challenging thing when people are living in long-term care, for example, who might have challenges with eating, how much to support them versus not support them. Timing of meals, this idea that it's rather flexible and when people want to eat it. I've been in some homes which are very small, and they offer a 24-hour service for food. That's not always achievable in very large environments, but this is the idea of the timing of meals is meant to meet the individual's needs. And then finally, the idea that the personal meaning of the dining experience is present, so people feel it's a meaningful time for them. It's not a task. They also contend, although there's limited research, that if you do have more person-centered mealtimes, the outcomes will be improved satisfaction with food and service, improved quality of life, and finally feeling a sense of control and independence, which is, in essence, more freedom. The challenge is, how do we do that? And it's very challenging. Personal choice is often a balance between, I should say, back up for a minute. You often have to balance out personal choice with medical complexity. So someone, for example, has swallowing problems. At what point, if they don't like a modified texture food, do we say it's your personal choice to not have that food versus you might choke? And how do you deal with that in terms of individualization? That's the trick. And how do we manage that so we don't have issues of concern about risk, of malnutrition, etc.? The Pioneer Network and others have suggested, though, that when people are not compliant with what you're doing, it's because they're not getting their choice. So it's something to think about. If you've got non-compliant folks with things like modified texture diets or diabetic diets or coming to the dining room at a certain time, it's because they don't feel their choice is being upheld. A potential framework for this person-centered care is some work that I've done called the life nourishment theory, and I'm not going to focus too much on this, but we identified 3 key concepts. The idea that mealtimes are about connecting, so this belonging that happens at mealtimes for all of us, especially in this environment where people might feel like they're lonely, for example. Honoring identity is also part of mealtimes, the idea that you get the food and you get the experience that is going to be dignified for you. It reaffirms who you are as an individual. And then the third concept I don't have listed on the slide is about the idea that mealtimes are about adapting to change. I'm going to focus in on this honoring identity a little bit more. And what we identified, this is a very complex slide, I don't expect you to read it all, but the key things to take away are that honoring identity is made up of lots of different things. It's about protecting dignity, about having a meaningful role, and reaffirming sense of self in the world. So I'll take the example of protecting dignity. Being acknowledged was one sub-concept. If you came to a dining room like this and no one said hello, no one said your name, you're not acknowledged. And right off, your dignity is going to be chipped away at. However, as you came into this dining room, someone ushered you to the table and said, hello, Mrs. Smith, it's wonderful to see you at lunch, and here's your table mates. They acknowledge who you are and are accepting of that. That's going to protect your dignity a bit more. And so, although this is a theory, it's certainly, the research suggests this might be useful to think about developing interventions. So that's something my research program is moving towards, is thinking about how we train staff to do person-centered care, so we can actually achieve some of these outcomes, hopefully. So, you're probably sitting there in your chair thinking, I can't do that. And you're right, there's some challenges to doing this. And we did a little bit of research just looking at menus in long-term care. And I had a student who happens to be in the audience here, Kate, who actually phoned up nutrition managers from 40 homes, long-term care homes in Ontario, and asked them how they plan the menus right now, and what are the challenges they have in planning those menus. And they identify that they're doing many things that are person-centered. They, upon admission, for example, determine the preference of individuals. They'll communicate the food profile and the preferences of that individual. They'll update the profile of an individual in terms of their needs and preferences on a quarterly basis. They'll have ongoing consultation through food councils or food committees. And they're often given an alternative choice or a third menu choice. So a lot of homes have moved towards some of these practices to try to meet the preferences, which as well as core components of person-centered care. However, the challenges are quite considerable. Resource limitations, not just food limitations, but labor limitations. So the funds available to give the sorts of choice for a diverse group of individuals and those preferences being met, as well as having well-trained staff who can do that. Think, for example, we had one, Kate can correct me if I'm wrong, don't do it now, but a northern home that had a hard time getting in diverse food products for a multicultural group. Thinking about storage in the kitchen, thinking about you can't always provide some of the staples for an individual who might be from a very different multicultural group than the vast majority. How do you meet that individual's preferences? It's very, very challenging. In addition to those resource limitations, there's some standards that make it a little bit challenging. For example, the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care standards in Ontario indicate that variation is certainly required and portion size are important. However, that means that there might be waste And there might be challenges with meeting variation, especially thinking about a pureed diet, for example, or modified texture diet, and how to match up those modified textures to the regular texture. That's very, very challenging and can be quite costly as well to try to do. And then finally, the last was that it's a real challenge to accommodate the diversity of preferences. A home like Winston Park, I'm sure Gail has got many diverse preferences. It's not just cultural, now it's also food in terms of tolerances and allergies. And how do you do that well? Another one of my graduate students, Holly Reimer, who did her doctorate work, actually interviewed staff in special care units for persons with significant dementia. And she wanted to identify what was person-centered care at mealtimes in that environment. And basically she identified person-centered care is a variety of things, and we have a long listing of key activities and key ways of providing food that are very person-centered. But what came out more from this research was how do we support that in this environment? And so she identified that first off, you have to know the resident extremely well. If you don't have staff who know the resident likes and dislikes, there's no way you can provide person-centered care. And the trick is how do you communicate that through all levels all the time? There was a researcher out in Simon Fraser University who's doing her PhD. She identified that the person who's most involved with the resident often doesn't get to read the chart. That's not her source of communication. It's usually verbal from person support worker to person support worker. So the transfer of knowledge is verbal. There's these gates between them and the professional staff. And this doesn't happen in terms of knowing the resident very well. Also the idea of having flexibility to optimize that care, knowing that if I don't do something today at breakfast, my management isn't going to come down on me. I've been given the flexibility to know the resident, know today they need this differently, and they're going to support me in that. So there's all these concepts she came out with that are really important to providing this person-centered care. Well, just back up 1 minute. And I pulled a quote out actually, this is from, again, the Pioneer Group. They identify that education, team building, and trust, that's what makes culture change, not the multi-million-dollar renovation. So this is about the people that are providing the care. That's where person-centered care happens. And so when we go back to that idea of fine dining, tablecloths, and fancy decorations, that is certainly very nice, but person-centered care goes beyond that. Just want to give you quickly one last slide before we wrap up. I've had the pleasure of being in Sweden a couple of times in the last year, and I wanted to tell you what a dining environment was in a long-term care dementia unit. First off, you have to realize Sweden's only 9 million people, and the majority of older adults live in the community even when they have significant functional problems and memory problems. Most of their long-term care homes are less than 100 people. In this unit, there were 12 individuals. They each had their own room. Their medications were kept in a locked cupboard in their room. There was no medication carts. When it was time for them to get their medications, staff would go, unlock the cupboard, give them the medication before they went to the dining room, so not in the dining room. The dining room was a long, sort of rectangular room. In the center was a U-shaped counter, which was the kitchen. And the kitchen was behind this. It had shutters, which could be open and shut, but on that counter were breads and water available all day long. The kitchen was right on the unit, so the food was cooked right on the unit, and individuals could see the food being cooked. They could wander up to the counter and talk to the staff that were in there. The staff were cross-trained. They were nursing staff, they were dietary staff, they were hospitality staff, they were maintenance staff. They do everything from laundry to providing food to providing eating assistance. So these cross-trained staff are really, really important. Individual setup. In that one little 12-member kitchen, there was an individual that needed to look out the window so she would not be distracted. She had no tablecloth, was given one portion of food at a time. There was a table of 4 men who had family-style dining. Food was put in a bowl provided to them, and they could serve themselves. They had beautiful flowers on the table and a tablecloth. There were 3 individuals who needed to be close to the kitchen in case they were having some challenges. They also had very nice tablecloth and placemat, no communication though happening at the table. So the staff member would come and sit with them and help them communicate. And then you would see a wife helping her husband eat at another table. You're going to ask me now how many staff there were. There were 4 staff for 12 people. Huge number of staff, so very different model. not something we can necessarily replicate in Canada, but just to show you that that is the ultimate, I think, in person-centered care. And the other thing to note was the meal was the activity. That meal was an hour and a half long. So I'm going to be working with my colleagues here in AHA over the next few years. Hopefully we'll get funding from CIHR, the same group that funded this get-together today. We're hoping to do something called Making the Most of Mealtimes. This is an ambitious research program over 5 years. If we get funding, it'll be the most comprehensive study in the world on long-term care and nutrition. And what we're going to be looking at is meal quality, so the food itself, the mealtime experience, which I've been talking about today, and also this idea of how we manage food access. And all of these things, how they impact food intake, and hopefully we can develop interventions that will improve food intake for older adults in long-term care in Canada. So I'd like you to take away a few points, hopefully, from my talk today. I hope you realize now how incredibly complex the dining experience is, and it leads to quality of life of residents in long-term care and retirement homes. Flexibility is essential. It means treating each resident as an individual. Some people you have to do more of that, and some less, because they're more individual perhaps, or more demanding, if you might want to call it that. But you have to also balance risk with dignity. You need to trust the residents and their families perhaps more than we're willing to. So I'm a dietitian. I know that when I go in and do a dietetic assessment and I see someone malnourished and know they should be on Ensure, they have every right to refuse it. And I need to stop there and say, that's their wish, and not push it and not feel like I haven't done my job. And I think that's something we have to do as nutrition managers, chefs, dietitians, realize we need to trust the residents a bit more. We also need to consider what we're working in now. You can't do the Swedish experience tomorrow. I'm not sure we can do it in 20 years in Canada, but there's probably something you can do. Perhaps it's training your staff to be more like providing a dignified experience when it comes to serving the food for folks. Maybe it's providing longer time to eat so that they don't feel rushed. There's all these sorts of things that can be done. Certainly it takes a lot of change and a lot of effort, but it's worthwhile. So I want to thank you today and challenge you to work towards person-centered care as you move forward.